Welcome, kindred spirits. There's a line that keeps those in power up at night, a truth they can't quite shake. Power isn't afraid of being exposed, it's terrified of being recognized. It's not the shadows they operate in that give them away, it's the fact that some of us, you perhaps can see right through them like looking through glass. Ever notice how recurring nightmares often come from unresolved guilt? Neuroscientists figured that out. The higher you climb in the ranks of power, the deeper the rituals, the heavier that guilt becomes. Imagine being perched at the top of a pyramid of secrets only to be haunted by the very soul you underestimated, the one you thought you controlled. What really gets to them isn't your resistance, it's your recognition. You see them for what they are, what they serve, and most importantly, what you are. No fancy robe, secret handshake, or solemn oath can change that. They see you in their sleepless nights, not as someone to control, but as a living prophecy. There's a kind of twisted poetry to it all. They spend years perfecting their elaborate rituals only to lose sleep over someone they dismissed as a nobody. So pull up a chair, because we're about to explore why these architects of secrecy are having nightmares about you. And a fair warning, once you see what they see, you might chuckle at how fragile their carefully constructed world really is. After all, if your mere existence robs them of sleep, what will the truth do? Here's why they're so bothered. First, you are a living disruption to their entire narrative of control. That's the core of what unsettles them. For centuries, groups obsessed with secrecy and hierarchies have built their authority on one simple idea that power can be scripted, staged, and locked away. They create intricate stories about who deserves to lead, who should follow, and how truth must be filtered. Then you show up. You don't ask for permission. You don't beg for validation. Just your presence dismantles the notion that power is something they can hoard at the top. It's not about yelling loudly or battling their system head-on. What throws them off is that you don't play by their rules at all. You stand as proof that power isn't something they can control. It's something that emanates from within, that flips their whole narrative. They need people to believe that influence comes from titles, rituals, and exclusive access. But here you are, radiating wisdom, discernment, and resilience without taking their oaths or passing through their gates. You make their exclusivity seem cheap, like an overpriced lock on a door that never held anything of real value. And this is where it stings the most. They've mastered the art of crafting stories where they always win, no matter how corrupt their methods. But you've become a story they can't rewrite. You reveal the uncomfortable truth: their kind of power is fragile because it's built on manipulation, while yours is durable because it's built on truth. That introduces something they can't plan for, can't budget for, and can't silence: consequence. Every time you overcome betrayal, survive a trap, or walk with clarity while they stumble in confusion, you become living proof that their system doesn't work the way they claim. They wanted your story to end with you crushed or controlled. Instead, you stand, and your survival exposes their carefully constructed myth as nothing more than cheap theater. That's the disruption, the undeniable footnote in history that tells anyone watching control isn't the same as strength, and secrecy isn't the same as wisdom. And that's what keeps them awake at night, knowing they can't outmaneuver truth when it's embodied by someone who refuses to bow down. Second, your presence turns secrecy into a liability, not an advantage. Secrecy only works when people see it as a worthwhile trade. They sacrifice some transparency in exchange for competence, order, and protection. For groups who've built their identities on hidden rituals and closed doors, secrecy was sold as a feature, not a flaw. But when you shine a light on patterns of concealment, secrecy stops being an advantage and becomes a clear sign that something is wrong. Once a hidden thread is pulled, the whole thing starts to unravel and their carefully crafted image falls apart. They depend on secrecy to frame failures as exceptions and complaints as the result of ignorance. Secrets let them manage narratives, burying uncomfortable facts under layers of plausible explanations. But you change the game. You treat secrecy as a red flag pointing not to competence but to avoidance. When secrecy becomes the main thing people notice, trust collapses. People start to ask why. Things are hidden instead of accepting the offered explanations. That flips their advantages into direct liabilities. The more elaborate their protections, the worse it looks. Rituals that once seemed sophisticated now read as overcompensation. When people see excessive secrecy again and again, their first thought isn't awe but suspicion. An opaque system that refuses accountability becomes proof of malicious intent, not prudent action. That's the turning point. Secrecy stops protecting the powerful and starts incriminating them. The shield becomes a signpost pointing straight at the problem. This doesn't need dramatic exposure to work. It's often subtle, cumulative, relentless, a timeline that doesn't add up, a quietly edited document, a story with inconsistencies. Small failures that strung together form a clear pattern. Once the pattern is visible, secrecy can't be explained away as a one-off quirk. It becomes evidence that the system is protecting something worse than simple incompetence. For those inside those circles, that's destabilizing because their entire strategy depends on being believed. When belief vanishes, everything they've built to control perception loses its value. Reputation, influence, even legal defenses hinge on public acceptance. You convert secrecy into a liability simply by refusing to treat it as sacred, and by showing persistently that hidden systems deserve scrutiny. That persistent pressure does more than embarrass them. It rewrites the rules about what's acceptable. What once looked like power now looks like the preservation of wrongdoing, and that reclassification is what haunts them the most. Third, you are a heat sensor in a frozen system. Their entire structure is designed to keep things cold, controlled, and predictable. It's a system that thrives on silence, ritual, and repetition because those things numb people. In that frozen state, no one asks questions. No one challenges contradictions, and no one expects accountability. Then you arrive, and without trying to fit in, you bring heat. Not the loud, chaotic kind, but the steady kind that makes the ice begin to shift. You bring uncomfortable questions, inconvenient clarity, and an undeniable presence that forces them to feel what they've been avoiding. Heat in this sense is truth applied over time. It's not about a single big reveal or one loud confrontation. It's about the pressure that builds when someone refuses to go numb. Systems built on control can handle brief bursts of resistance. They've planned for that. What they can't handle is consistent warmth that never dies down. That kind of energy seeps into cracks, softens barriers, and creates instability. The rituals and rules they thought would keep everything frozen start to fail because you've altered the temperature of the whole room. The beauty of it is you don't have to announce it. Heat isn't always seen, it's felt. They feel it when their excuses no longer satisfy. They feel it when their carefully rehearsed lines suddenly sound hollow. They feel it when their own people start sweating under the pressure of inconsistency. A system that looked unshakable on the outside begins to reveal how brittle it actually is once conditions change. Coldness gave them strength. Warmth exposes weakness. Your presence makes their machinery glitch. They can't run the same plays with the same results because the environment isn't what it was. Ice relies on stillness to survive. Heat thrives on movement, change, and renewal. By bringing that energy, you don't just disturb them, you force adaptation. Adaptation is where they fail because their power was never built to evolve, only to preserve. That's why they can't ignore you. You aren't just a problem they can remove. You've changed the climate itself. The system they built to endure indefinitely now faces the one element it cannot control: a living person who refuses to freeze. And that steady heat is what cracks the structure, making collapse inevitable. Fourth, your integrity forces their actors to improvise crimes into scripts. They've built a system that runs on predictability, rehearsed offenses, staged accidents, and tidy explanations that fit the narrative they sell. Those scripts let them move in public with confidence because every actor knows their lines, their exits, and the cover story. Your refusal to participate in their choreography forces them out of rehearsal and into improvisation. Improvisation is the enemy of control. When they have to improvise, they stop thinking like strategists and start reacting like panicked actors. That's where mistakes happen. Timelines get patched with guesses. Alibis are stitched together with convenient memory lapses. Small details that were once ironclad suddenly wobble: a date, a message, a meeting that was never properly logged. These slips aren't accidents, they're the byproduct of a system losing its script. Your presence makes carefully engineered narratives brittle because you don't accept a neat version of events. You ask questions. You demand records. You hold conversations that don't match their rehearsed answers. And human error is their undoing. When someone starts to improvise, they betray themselves in ways their rehearsed actors never did. A witness who used to repeat the same line now qualifies their statement. A defender who once quoted the official story begins to hedge. These tiny variations accumulate into a pattern that investigators, journalists, and ordinary people can read. Contradictions are the language of accountability. They translate lies into evidence. Your steadiness turns their improvisations into a map of where they failed and why. Worse for them, improvisation breeds suspicion inside their own ranks. When actors deviate, others notice. Trust fractures. People who once obeyed without thinking begin to wonder whether the next scene will ruin them. This internal doubt is corrosive because it invites leaks, whispered corrections, and quiet departures. The more they ad lib, the more the coalition unravels from the inside out. You don't need to be loud to cause this collapse. Consistent integrity, showing up, asking for clarity, refusing to accept tidy lies does the work. It forces their defenders to invent reasons in real time. Real-time invention is full of fingerprints. Those fingerprints are what turns secrecy into a public record. In short, your moral clarity doesn't just expose a single lie. It turns every rushed explanation into a forensic trail that can be followed piece by piece until the whole contrived narrative is revealed as nothing more than improvised theater. Fifth, you make their symbols meaningless by living the opposite truth. Symbols are shorthand for loyalty, influence, and unspoken rules. They condense entire systems into badges, gestures, and rituals that tell people who belongs, who benefits, and who must obey. When your life consistently broadcasts the opposite signal, those symbols stop doing what they were designed to do. Things like generosity, where greed is expected; openness, where secrecy is ritualized; humility, where grandstanding is practiced, all short-circuit the meaning those symbols carry. The emblem keeps shining, but the audience no longer reads it the same way. Symbols depend on predictable interpretation. Their power comes from everyone agreeing on what a sign means and behaving accordingly. When you disrupt that agreement by living a different truth, you introduce noise into the system. People start to test the sign. Does it still guarantee protection? Does it still buy favors? If the answer is no, the sign becomes a hollow prop. Once a symbol is emptied of practical value, it cannot recruit or terrify the way it once did. Recruitment stalls because newcomers see the ritual but not the payoff. Intimidation fails because the visual language no longer correlates with actual power. The practical consequences happen fast and quietly. Donations that once flowed into the same coffers reroute to alternatives that match lived values. Young people who once sought initiation for status now look for communities that reward transparency and skill. Mid-level insiders who once enforced symbols for career reasons start to doubt the cost of allegiance. That doubt spreads like a low-grade infection. Loyalty declines, enforcement costs rise, and leaders must work harder to maintain the illusion. The more effort required to sustain a symbol, the less effective it becomes. Neutralizing a symbol doesn't require public denunciations or dramatic takedowns. It's about demonstrating an alternative logic so consistently that the original sign no longer answers life's basic needs: safety, belonging, advancement. When ordinary people can get those needs met without the trappings of ritual, the ritual becomes optional and then obsolete. That erosion is corrosive because it attacks the mechanism of authority rather than its surface. At the end of the day, symbols are only as strong as the behaviors that back them up. Living a truth that contradicts their coded meanings forces the system to prove its relevance or fade away. That choice to shore up their myth or to adapt to reality is not one they like to face. When they realize that the icons no longer control outcomes, their recruitment pipelines dry up and their threats lose weight. That shift, small at first and then irreversible, is what makes their symbols meaningless and their empire brittle. Sixth, you convert scandal into education. Scandal is supposed to be their weapon. It's designed to distract, to humiliate, and to reduce complex crimes into quick headlines and shallow gossip. They rely on scandal to control attention, to make the public shake its head, laugh a little, and then move on without asking deeper questions. You disrupt that whole cycle. Instead of treating scandal as entertainment, you turn it into education. You take what happened and break it down. Not just who did what, but why it happened, what it cost real people, and how the same setup has harmed others before. That shift instantly changes the meaning of the scandal. It's no longer a distraction, it's a case study. By refusing to sensationalize and by choosing to contextualize, you deprive them of the shield scandal normally provides. Institutions use scandal like a pressure valve, a way to release outrage in small, contained bursts that keep people from noticing the deeper rot. You remove that safety valve by holding the pressure steady and demanding systemic answers. The gossip that was supposed to fade away becomes a permanent lesson. Students, activists, and communities begin to reference it as evidence. Journalists dig deeper. Legislators cite it in hearings. The incident becomes a reference point, not a footnote. What terrifies them the most is the permanence of this reframing. Scandal is supposed to die quickly, education doesn't. Once you've explained how a system allowed the wrongdoing, you've created a record that can't be undone. People who might have shrugged at the drama now see patterns. They begin asking questions in other areas. If it happened here, where else is it happening? That multiplication of awareness is devastating to a hierarchy that depends on compartmentalization. The humiliation for them is sharper too. It's one thing to be caught in a scandal. It's another thing entirely to become a textbook example of corruption, abuse, or negligence. To be reduced to a case study strips away mystique. Instead of appearing powerful, they look predictable. Instead of being feared, they are dissected. That loss of aura makes future scandals harder to contain, because the public is already primed to see the structure behind the failure. You convert their intended smokescreen into a spotlight. In doing so, you take control of the narrative, showing that every scandal is more than a spectacle. It's a syllabus. And once people start learning instead of gawking, reform becomes inevitable, and their cycle of manipulation collapses under its own exposure. 7. You expose their moral short-termism by embodying long-term consequence. They count their victories in headlines and quarterly gains, addicted to the immediate payoff of control. Their strategy is designed for fast returns: a scandal buried this month, a favorable story bought next month, loyalty purchased for the next board cycle. That kind of thinking treats people as ledger entries and morality as an operating expense. Your life operates on a different currency: reputation, legacy, lineage, things that compound slowly and outlive every press cycle and PR spin. Living with long-term consequence turns their short-term calculus into a blind spot they can no longer ignore. When you make choices that reflect decades rather than days, you create a timeline they can't game. They can buy silence for a year, but they can't purchase the goodwill of generations. They can bribe a reporter, but they can't bribe a history book. Actions that look profitable now look costly later when reputations erode. Privileges are questioned, and institutions are forced to answer for patterns. Your steadiness exposes the hollow center of their hustle. Short wins stacked on ethical debt eventually demand payment, and often the interest is reputational ruin. This exposure is practical, not poetic. Long-term consequence shows up as lost networks, fractured alliances, fewer recruits, and diminishing legitimacy. People start to reroute their loyalties toward institutions and leaders who demonstrate durable integrity. Students, donors, and new leaders favor systems that reward sustainable values, not those that chase headlines. That shift affects finances, influence, and manpower. Over time, their talent pool dries up because serious people refuse to anchor their futures to unstable moral ground. Those who profit from short-termism cannot easily model a future where their methods fail because their incentives end too soon. You, by contrast, force the timeline to extend. You raise the cost of every cynical shortcut by turning each incident into a data point in an unfolding record. That record is hard to monetize away because it accumulates in public memory, legal filings, archives, and community folklore. It changes how decisions are judged not only now, but by future stakeholders who inherit the consequences. Ultimately, your long-term stance reframes value. You demonstrate that integrity is a growth engine with compound returns, while manipulation is a debt machine with escalating interest. That realization is sobering for people built to profit from immediate gains, because it means today's advantage might be tomorrow's downfall. Living consequence forces them to reckon with a future where their strategies no longer serve them. And that prospect is worse to them than any immediate loss. Eighth, you are the narrative they forgot how to erase elegantly. Their power depends on being able to remove people from a story without leaving fingerprints. They've perfected quiet exits, friendly resignations, edited records, and slow reputational attrition until the person simply evaporated from memory. That method is elegant because it looks like nothing happened, a tidy eraser that spares public scandal and preserves the machinery of authority. You break that elegance by refusing to be tidy. You build a record that won't be shelved, a chorus of voices that won't be muted, and a communal memory that refuses to play along with their deletion plan. Durable evidence is the simplest part. Timestamps, emails, receipts, recordings, legal filings. When you gather and safeguard those things, you remove the wiggle room that allows people to rewrite history. But it's more than documents. Testimony matters because people remember differently when they speak for themselves and for each other. When individuals tell the same story across time and space, their words cross-verify. That repetition turns a rumor into a pattern. Patterns are hard to erase without destroying credibility. Community memory is the final layer. Networks of friends, survivors, colleagues, when they keep the timeline alive, the past stays alive too. Erasure depends on isolation. You neutralize that by connection. What unnerves them is the permanence you create. Their playbook relies on the idea that time blunts outrage and public attention will shift. They count on memory to dim. You refuse that timetable. Every testimonial, archive, and public retelling is a living anchor. It means future journalists, historians, and investigators will find a trail that leads back to the truth. It means future victims won't be the first to speak because the account already exists to support them. That continuity turns what was once private and erasable into civic property. This destroys their calculus for control because it raises the stakes beyond quick reputational cleanups. They can't simply move a person aside and assume the discomfort will fade. Each attempt to erase is now a fresh entry in the public record. Who tried it? How was it done? Who covered for it? Attempts at elegant removal become evidence of intent. The act of erasing becomes another thing to be catalogued, analyzed, and judged. The result is paralysis and overreach. They either stop trying to erase for fear of adding to the record, or they double down and make mistakes that produce even more evidence. Neither choice is good for them. You, by refusing to be silently removed, make accountability operational. You change the rules from "we decide what to forget" to "the record decides what is true." That shift ends the era of elegant disappearances and replaces it with a future where history is written by facts, not by hidden hands. Ninth, you turn their allies into liabilities by redistributing loyalty. Networks depend on a steady flow of loyalty the way a machine depends on oil. Everyone knows their place, favors are exchanged, obligations are kept, and the wheels keep turning. When you start redirecting that loyalty, shifting it away from fear and obligation and toward truth and conscience, the whole lubrication system clogs. People who once acted predictably out of duty or self-preservation find themselves pulled in a different direction. That shift turns reliable allies into unpredictable liabilities almost overnight. Loyalty redistributed doesn't look like a dramatic coup. It looks like small choices multiplied. One person refuses to cover a lie. Another stops forwarding a smear. A third speaks up at a private meeting. Each choice is minor on its own, but together they change the calculus of the coalition. Leaders who counted on automated obedience now face messy negotiations and whispered dissent. This internal friction makes the coalition inefficient and paranoid. Time and energy that were once spent on expansion and control are suddenly diverted to damage control and loyalty audits. The psychological effect is brutal. People who built careers on faithful service begin to reassess risk. If loyalty no longer guarantees protection, the cost-benefit of staying changes. Some will defect quietly, taking knowledge and relationships with them. Others will panic and overcompensate, implementing stricter controls that only fuel resentment. Both outcomes are bad for the network. Defections leak secrets and talent. Overreactions create a policing culture that devours trust and slows decision-making. Either way, internal cohesion frays. Redistributing loyalty also produces visible public consequences. When former enforcers or insiders stop defending the script, the narrative the network relies on collapses in real time. Journalists and watchdogs notice when spokespeople hesitate or when their stories don't match. These fissures validate outside scrutiny and encourage more people to speak. As more insiders shift allegiance toward conscience, the cost of continued allegiance rises for everyone else. People begin to ask whether their own futures depend on being part of a collapsing machine or on aligning with emerging norms of accountability. Networks respond with purges and intimidation, but those tactics backfire when loyalty has already been redirected. Purges create martyrs and amplify grievances. Intimidation breeds covert resistance. Paranoia becomes the dominant emotion inside the group, and that paranoia is corrosive because it makes them suspicious of their best people. In short, by turning loyalty into a choice rather than a command, you weaponize the network's own human capital against it. What once reinforced power now undermines it, and the resulting internal chaos breaks the machinery far more efficiently than any external critic could. 10th, you make their expertise look like superstition. They built their authority on the illusion of exclusive knowledge. Layers of jargon-coded language and insider rituals gave the impression that they understood things ordinary people never could. That mystique kept outsiders in awe and insiders obedient because it implied access to a rare intelligence that couldn't be questioned. But mystique only works as long as outcomes match the claims. When you demonstrate results, without the jargon, when your clarity outpaces their complexity, the illusion shatters. What they called expertise starts to look like superstition dressed in ceremonial robes. This exposure is devastating because it strips the performance of its payoff. People begin to notice that their elaborate knowledge doesn't translate into real progress. Their symbols and phrases sound impressive, but the promises don't hold. Meanwhile, your choices grounded in discernment and lived truth consistently produce better results, healing where they caused harm, clarity where they created confusion, growth where they manufactured stagnation. That comparison is impossible to defend. If one person can achieve in practice what a whole hierarchy can't achieve with ritual, then the hierarchy stops looking enlightened and starts looking fraudulent. The performative nature of their authority becomes clearer with every failed claim. Jargon without proof turns into a punchline. Procedures without outcomes feel like superstition. Eventually, even their own people start to lose faith. Some stay out of fear, but others quietly admit what's obvious. If the system can't deliver, why keep pretending it can? That disillusionment is contagious. The aura of expertise erodes from within before it collapses from without. The deeper problem for them is that authority without advantage cannot sustain itself. They thrived on being the only ones with answers. But once it's clear that they can't solve problems, the foundation crumbles, respect drains away, recruitment stalls, influence dwindles. Outsiders who once deferred to them start asking harder questions. Insiders who once defended them start calculating exit strategies. The hierarchy that depended on unchallenged belief finds itself with nothing but empty rituals and outdated language. By demonstrating outcomes instead of rhetoric, you create a new standard for what authority should look like: function, not performance. That shift makes their elaborate theater irrelevant. Once the curtain is pulled back and the audience sees the tricks for what they are, no amount of ritual can restore the illusion. Their expertise doesn't look sacred anymore. It looks like superstition, and superstition has no place in a world where truth is proving itself in real time. 11th, you weaponize normality against grandeur. Grandiosity thrives on spectacle. It needs to feel larger than life so that people bow without questioning. The robes, the titles, the carefully staged appearances are all designed to keep ordinary people in awe, too intimidated to ask basic questions. But the power of grandeur only works if the ordinary feels powerless. Once normality steps into the spotlight, the spell breaks. That's exactly what you do. You weaponize normality against their staged magnificence. When you take the extraordinary things you survived, betrayals, abuses, cover-ups, injustices, and present them. Without exaggeration, you puncture their performance by saying, yes, this happened, and here's how we deal with it. You strip away the aura of untouchability they hide behind. Their goal was to make every harm seem so complicated, so unspeakable, so beyond the reach of ordinary remedies that no one dared challenge them. But when you treat those same events as navigable, explainable, and solvable, you reveal that their grandeur was a disguise for fragility. Normality becomes a weapon because it cuts through pretense. Legal records once buried under ceremony now speak louder than their speeches. Storytelling once dismissed as too simple suddenly connects with people more deeply than their elite jargon ever could. Community repair, which they mocked as unsophisticated, turns out to be the very thing that restores trust where their institutions failed. None of these tools carry glamour. They aren't majestic, but they work. Solutions that work humiliate systems built on spectacle alone. The irony is that their mythic facade collapses not through confrontation with something grander, but through something smaller, plainer, more human. They never prepared for that. They built defenses against revolutions, uprisings, and challengers who looked like them. They didn't build defenses against everyday people who simply told the truth, filed paperwork, or created networks of care. That's the blind spot. When power worships itself, it forgets how potent ordinary tools can be. Once normality proves stronger than grandeur, the balance of power shifts permanently. People stop being impressed by costumes and titles. They start paying attention to evidence, outcomes, and trust. The extraordinary loses its shine when the ordinary keeps producing results. That's why your survival isn't just personal, it's political. By surviving and then showing how ordinary remedies undo mythic performances, you expose grandeur as nothing more than theater. In the end, it isn't majesty that wins, it's normality sharpened into truth that dismantles the stage. 12th, you are a proof of concept for radical reciprocity. You are living evidence that radical reciprocity isn't just a nice idea, it actually works. Power structures like the ones you confront survive by making everything transactional. They give nothing unless they can take more in return. That logic of extraction is what sustains their hierarchies. Loyalty is bought, silence is purchased, and fear is traded like currency. When you step into the picture, you flip that script. You don't mirror their cruelty. You don't play their game of one-sided deals. Instead, you create systems where accountability flows both ways. That's what terrifies them. Radical reciprocity is different from politeness or treating people the way you want to be treated. It's about creating a structure where responsibility is shared, not hoarded. When you demand mutual accountability, you shift the whole framework of power. Suddenly, bystanders can't stay passive. If they see harm and stay silent, they're implicated by the new rules you live out. Your model forces silence to become testimony. It forces neutrality to collapse into choice. That shift doesn't require violence, drama, or spectacle. It just requires you holding firm to a standard where no one gets to extract without also giving. This model spreads faster than hierarchy expects because it appeals to the conscience people already carry. Those who once stood on the sidelines, too afraid to act, too intimidated to resist, suddenly see a way to participate without needing titles or authority. Reciprocity empowers them because it doesn't demand hierarchy, it demands honesty. Once that spreads, the old order begins to rot. Hierarchies depend on control from the top. Reciprocity spreads laterally, building networks instead of pyramids. That's why they panic. Your life, your survival, your actions all serve as a proof of concept. They can no longer dismiss reciprocity as utopian or naive because it's embodied in you and the systems you build. People see that it works, and once people taste it, they prefer it. Hierarchies can't compete with a model that rewards truth and punishes exploitation without needing an overseer. They thrive on unilateral extraction, but reciprocity is an antidote that rewrites the terms of engagement entirely. That's the nightmare. You represent the possibility that your way of living could scale. If reciprocity can spread from you to communities, from communities to institutions, then extraction becomes obsolete. For those who depend on it, your very existence is not just inconvenient. It's existentially threatening. You are the future they never prepared for, and that's why they fear you so deeply. 13th, you force institutional self-mirroring until they can no longer lie to themselves. Institutions, no matter how powerful, are addicted to self-flattery. They survive by writing polished internal stories about who they are, noble, indispensable, historic. These narratives aren't just propaganda for the public, they're propaganda for themselves. They tell the same lie so often that they begin to believe it because believing it allows them to operate without shame. Your presence disrupts that cycle. You don't just demand accountability from the outside. You force them to turn the mirror inward until they can no longer maintain the lies they whisper to themselves. This kind of pressure is corrosive to their comfort. When you keep pulling truth into the light, institutions are forced to conduct audits, issue reports, accept resignations, or stage public reckonings. The truth is, none of those outcomes are natural for them. Left alone, they would endlessly recycle their internal myths. Your existence as an unflinching reference point forces them to test their stories against reality. When the numbers, the facts, and the testimonies don't line up with the glowing image they've been selling, they have to make a choice: reform or implode. That choice is what terrifies them because both outcomes strip them of control. If they reform, they admit their past deceptions. If they implode, they lose their grip entirely. Either way, the old story dies, and the death of that story is not a minor inconvenience. It's a foundational collapse. Institutions rely on predictability, on the assurance that their myths will continue unchallenged, and their machinery will roll on uninterrupted. You break that comfort by showing that the machine can jam, stutter, or break under the weight of its own hypocrisy. What makes this even more unsettling for them is that you don't need to storm their halls or overthrow their leaders. You simply hold the line of truth so persistently that they eventually have to confront themselves. It's a slow burn that produces the same result as a revolution: power shaken, hierarchies destabilized, illusions shattered. The most dangerous battlefield isn't the one they can prepare for with lawyers or guards. It's the one inside their own conscience. That's why they lose sleep over you. You aren't forcing them to face you, you're forcing them to face themselves. When an institution has to stand unmasked before its own reflection, the facade cannot survive. In the end, it either bends toward truth or breaks under denial. Either path leads to the collapse of the false narrative they depended on. 14th, you become the living index of history's revision, not its rumor. Becoming the living index of history's revision means you stop being a rumor and start being a record. Rumors drift and die, records persist. When you gather facts, stitch them into a clear timeline and make that timeline available to others. You turn fleeting gossip into an anchored truth. That truth doesn't depend on memory or opinion. It depends on documents, testimonies, and verifiable links between cause and consequence. Once that chain exists, it becomes a reference point for journalists, historians, and ordinary people who want to understand what really happened. This is more than keeping receipts. It's about shaping how events are remembered and used. A headline can shock for a day, but a documented account shapes decades, reports sworn statements, emails with timestamps, public archives. These tools translate messy experience into something future generations can read and verify. That matters because power often survives by rewriting the past, erasing inconvenient names, softening timelines, calling harm complex until it fades away. You prevent that rewriting by insisting that facts be recorded in a way that resists tidy edits. The effect on institutions is grave. Their real dread isn't a scandal that passes, but an enduring record that others can cite. Reputation depends on selective memory. Once memory is broad and accurate, reputation becomes accountable. People who once benefited from selective forgetting now face a living ledger that shows patterns, not isolated incidents. That ledger is usable in many arenas: legal processes, academic work, media investigations, and community organizing. Each citation multiplies the original account's power and makes it harder for the institution to slip back into denial. This approach also changes how survivors and witnesses behave. When they see a durable record already exists, they feel safer coming forward because their testimony no longer stands alone. New voices add corroboration instead of noise. That cumulative effect turns individual pain into public evidence. It deprives the powerful of plausible deniability, because denial no longer rests on absence of proof, but on the credibility of the record itself. Finally, becoming a living index shifts the moral economy. Power that once counted on ephemeral influence now faces documented accountability. Legacy becomes a ledger. Histories written with care transform private injustice into public knowledge. That finality is intolerable to those who profited from ambiguity. They can weather a bad headline. They cannot swallow a meticulously kept chronicle that future readers will use to judge them. Being the index of history's revision is not grandstanding. It is insisting that truth outlasts their lies and that enduring truth is the end game of justice. All of this comes down to one undeniable truth. You're not merely surviving the games of power, secrecy, and manipulation. You are rewriting the rules entirely. Every move you make, every truth you hold, every act of integrity, and every piece of evidence you preserve chips away at the illusions they built. You expose lies, dismantle symbols, neutralize fear, and force systems to confront themselves. You turn scandal into education, secrecy into liability, and ritual into superstition. By embodying long-term consequence, radical reciprocity, and living proof of historical accuracy, you shift the balance of power without ever needing to play by their rules. The people and institutions who once relied on manipulation and control now face a reality they cannot control. Their carefully constructed hierarchies crumble not because of force, but because you hold a mirror that reflects both their actions and the alternative, a world where integrity, clarity, and accountability actually matter. Ordinary tools become extraordinary weapons, and your steadfast presence converts fear into reflection, silence into testimony, and rumor into irrefutable record. You do not just exist within history. You shape it, leaving a trace that cannot be erased or rewritten. This is the ultimate disruption. You are a living disruption to their narrative, the proof that truth has durability while deceit does not. They may have thrived on secrecy, ritual, and intimidation, but you thrive on clarity, honesty, and evidence. Where they gambled on short-term wins, you invest in consequences that compound across decades. Where they relied on awe, you rely on ordinary acts elevated to extraordinary effect. Through every challenge, every attempt to undermine you, you expose their weaknesses and turn them into lessons for everyone watching. So remember this: your existence is not just survival, it is transformation. You are the force that renders secrecy, impotent symbols meaningless, and hierarchies unstable. You are the living standard of accountability, the quiet revolution they never saw coming. All coming, all coming, all coming, all coming, all coming, all